All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are tackling one of the most fascinating intellectual puzzles out there, the academic search for the historical Jesus. Now, this isn't about faith or theology. Think of it like a detective story. We're using the tools of history to try and understand a figure who absolutely changed the world. So, let's grab that magnifying glass and start the investigation.
This right here, this is the central question. It's what drives all of this scholarship. You see, historians aren't trying to prove or disprove anyone's belief. Nope. What they're really asking is, if you could peel back all the layers of theological interpretation added over centuries, who was the actual man, Jesus of Nazareth, as a person living in his own time, in first-century Jewish Palestine? So here's our game plan. We'll start with what this whole quest is all about. Then we're going to explore the main theories scholars have about Jesus, the apocalyptic prophet idea. After that, we'll tackle the big question of divinity, look at our primary sources, the Gospels, and touch on some other important views before we wrap it all up.
Okay, first things first. We have to get our heads around the absolute foundational rule of this entire field. You have to separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith.
This is so important. For a historian, Jesus of Nazareth was a first-century Jew. That's the starting point. The whole academic job is to place him right back into that world, a world of Roman occupation, all these diverse Jewish beliefs, a lot of social unrest, and try to understand his message and his actions the way people back then might have.
So that brings us to what is, by a long shot, the most common position in modern scholarship. What did this historical person actually talk about? Well, most scholars seem to agree on one particular role.
An apocalyptic prophet. Now, this is a very specific term. It doesn't mean end of the world like in some disaster movie. It refers to this belief, which was actually pretty common back then, that history was about to hit a massive climax. God himself was about to step in, overthrow evil, and set up his own kingdom right here on Earth.
And look, this isn't some new or fringe idea. It's got a really strong academic history that goes back more than 100 years. Albert Schweitzer really kicked it off way back in 1906. Then you get scholars like E.P. Sanders and, more recently, Bart Ehrman, who've just built this enormous case arguing that, really, this apocalyptic framework is the only one that makes sense of Jesus' teachings.
And the absolute heart of this theory is urgency. Jesus' message wasn't just, a nice set of timeless ethical rules. It was a warning and a promise. Change your ways, because the world as you know it is ending and God's judgment is coming. And it's coming soon, like within the lifetime of the people he was talking to.
Okay, but wait a minute. That raises a huge question, right? If the historical Jesus was mainly an apocalyptic prophet, how do we get to the divine Son of God of Christian theology? That's the next big puzzle that historians have to piece together.
While the mainstream scholarly argument is that it was a process, a development. It starts with the historical prophet, then, bam, the crucifixion. For an apocalyptic movement, that's a catastrophic failure. But then, his followers' belief that he was resurrected changes everything. They start reinterpreting his entire life and his message through this powerful new lens, applying titles like Messiah and Son of God that over time take on bigger and bigger meaning.
And this isn't just a hunch. This theory is built on decades of super detailed work by major scholars. You've got Rudolf Bultmann, who argued that the Christ of faith we read about was really born from the preaching of the early apostles. Or James D.G. Dunn, who actually traced how the views of Jesus' divinity, what he called high Christologies, grew over decades. They weren't just there from day one.
So how can scholars even begin to try and separate that historical prophet from the theological Christ? Well, the answer is all about how they read the sources. And honestly, this is the big aha moment for understanding this whole project.
The way to think about the Gospels, according to most scholars, is that they aren't neutral biographies. Not at all. They're a hybrid. On the one hand, yeah, they contain real memories and oral traditions about what Jesus actually said and did. But on the other hand, they're these profound statements of faith, written decades later by people who already believed Jesus was the resurrected Lord.
This quote, right here, just nails it. The authors of the Gospels, the evangelists, they weren't just recording history like a court stenographer. They were interpreting it. They were trying to explain the meaning of Jesus' life because of their belief in the resurrection. They were writing theology, but using the raw material of history to do it. So what does that actually mean when you're reading? It means historians get pretty skeptical of parts that seem to serve a very clear theological point. Take the stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew and Luke, for example. Most scholars see those not as literal history, but as theological arguments written long after the fact to make a point about who Jesus was.
Now, even though that apocalyptic prophet model is the dominant one, it is definitely not the only view out there. And it's really important to look at some of the other scholarly portraits of Jesus to get a fuller picture of the debate.
For instance, you've got scholars like John Dominic Crossan. He argues Jesus was less of an apocalyptic prophet and more of a radical social critic, a wisdom teacher, kind of like the Greek Cynic philosophers. Then there are others, like the late Marcus Borg, who saw Jesus mainly as a Jewish mystic, a spirit person who was all about experiencing God's presence right here and now, not waiting for some fiery end of the world.
So, where does all of this leave us? Well, the debate is alive and well. It's definitely ongoing, but the main outlines of it are pretty clear.
And this lays out the central tension perfectly. The mainstream view sticks with the apocalyptic prophet whose divine status came later. The minority views, on the other hand, they kind of downplay all that apocalyptic stuff and focus way more on Jesus' role as a brilliant ethical teacher or a spiritual guide.
And in the end, this is what makes the historian's job so incredibly challenging. They aren't working with raw data, they're working with texts that are already interpretations, written by believers for believers. So the work of the historian is basically an interpretation of an interpretation.
Which leaves us with this one last, absolutely fascinating question. It's the big dilemma right at the heart of this whole quest for the historical Jesus. If our only real windows into his life were all written through the lens of profound faith, what are the limits of history? What can we ever truly know for sure? That, right there, is the question that keeps this academic detective story going.